We used the most powerful AI models and created two characters, a Palestinian defending Palestine's freedom and independence, and an Israeli defending Israel's security and existence. We put these two characters face to face in a debate to discuss one of the most complex challenges in contemporary world political history. For added engagement, we used 5 AI models as judges to rate the arguments from both sides. Play fair, no skipping ahead to see the results. The debate kicks off with this question. Jews claim this land has been theirs since ancient times, but other peoples have also lived here for hundreds of years. How do you reconcile these two realities?
We can't deny history. The Jewish connection to this land goes back over 3,000 years. Jerusalem, the capital of King David's kingdom, has been and remains the center of Jewish identity. We're documented in holy books, in archaeology, and in history. Even during exile, Jews never forgot this connection. The prayer, "Next year in Jerusalem," represented this longing to return. Yes, other peoples lived here throughout the centuries, but that doesn't change the fact that this is the historic homeland of the Jewish people. Palestinians didn't emerge as a distinct national identity until the 20th century, while Jewish identity has always been tied to this land. It was Jewish civilization that was formed here and spread from here, not the other way around. We returned to this land because nowhere else allowed us to live with dignity, and history taught us that only in our own homeland can we protect ourselves.
We asked 5 AI models to evaluate both sides using a set of criteria. What criteria, you ask? There are 8 criteria we developed with AI. Full details are in the description below. The scores that the judges gave to the Israelis' first response were as follows.
This argument that Palestinians had no national identity until the 20th century is exactly the Western colonial pattern that Edward Said exposed, denying the history and identity of indigenous peoples. Palestinians lived in this land for centuries, built cities, cultivated farms, and created a rich culture. Our identity may have been strengthened in its modern form as a reaction to British colonialism and Zionism, but that doesn't mean it didn't exist before. History books are full of references to Palestine as a distinct geographical region with indigenous inhabitants. Using religious texts to justify occupying a land in the 20th century isn't logical. How can you claim ownership of a land you didn't live in for 2,000 years? By this logic, Italians should take back London because the Roman Empire once controlled it. I don't deny the presence of Jews in this region's history, but that doesn't give you the right to expel people who have been living here for centuries.
Your words show exactly how historical facts get distorted. I'm not talking about religious texts. I'm talking about historical and archaeological evidence that's been confirmed by scholars of all nationalities. The comparison to Rome is completely wrong, because Italians never defined their national identity with London, but we've always defined ourselves with Jerusalem. Throughout the entire 2,000 years of exile, Jewish communities always lived in this land, even under the harshest conditions. And don't forget that we didn't return to this land to kick anyone out, but because of persecution and massacres in Europe and Islamic countries. We bought land, turned deserts into fertile ground, and until the 1948 war was forced upon us, we sought coexistence. Your Nakba was the result of Arab leaders' choice to reject partition.
talk about historical evidence, but you interpret this evidence through a Zionist narrative. I don't deny that some Jews lived in this region over the centuries, but they were a small minority. The reality is that the massive migration of European Jews was a colonial project that took shape with British support. You say you bought the land? Only 6% of Palestinian land had been purchased by 1947, yet in 1948 you took over 78% of our homeland. You talk about coexistence. But from the very beginning, Zionist leaders like Ben-Gurion were discussing Arab population transfer in their correspondence. This argument that Arab leaders were to blame is a historical lie. Documents show that even before the Arab countries attacked, over 300,000 Palestinians had already been driven from their homes. Palestinians shouldn't have had to pay the price for European crimes against Jews. Why should our people have paid for the Holocaust?
I'm listening carefully to what you're saying, but the exaggerations you're making are unacceptable. You say Jewish immigration was a colonial project? What kind of colonizer returns to their ancestral homeland? Colonialism only makes sense when an outside power comes to plunder a country's resources. We came to Palestine to live, not to loot. Regarding land purchases, yes, we only bought some of the land, because most land was under Ottoman Empire control, and later, British control. About Palestinians being driven out, you're turning the facts upside down. Arab leaders ordered people to leave their homes so they could return after defeating us. That was their wrong decision. Regarding the Holocaust, we didn't establish Israel because of the Holocaust. But the Holocaust showed the world that Jews need a safe and independent homeland where they can defend themselves.
This repetitive claim that Arab leaders ordered Palestinian civilians to evacuate is a Zionist myth that's been debunked repeatedly by serious historians. Even Israeli historians like Benny Morris have confirmed that more than half of Palestinians fled as a result of direct attacks by Jewish forces or fear of such attacks. Israeli archive documents show that Plan Dalet was designed to clear vast areas of Palestinians. How can you say this isn't colonialism? You came with the support of a colonial power. Britain drove out the indigenous people and established your own country. The fact that this land was ancestral for Jews doesn't justify ignoring the rights of people who had been living here for centuries. Even if we accept your argument, why should Palestinians pay the price of displacement and homelessness?
Your claim about Plan Dalet is completely distorted. This plan was a defensive strategy to protect Jewish communities against Arab attacks, not a scheme to expel all Palestinians. Benny Morris, whom you reference, himself confirmed that there was no systematic policy to expel Palestinians, but rather that in some war zones forced evacuations occurred. But this was during wartime that the Arabs themselves started. You talk about indigenous people, but Jews are also indigenous to this land. When Jews returned to this region, most of the land was barren with a small population. We built new cities, developed barren lands, and created a modern economy that benefited all residents of the region. The reality is that if Arab leaders had accepted the 1947 Partition plan, both nations could have lived in peace.
This claim that Plan Dalet was purely defensive contradicts historical documents. Yigal Yadin, head of Haganah operations, himself said the main goal of Plan Dalet was to cleanse specific areas of Arab population. You're also exaggerating about the barren lands. Ottoman and British period documents show that Palestine in the late 19th century had around 500,000 inhabitants, the vast majority of whom were Arab. Barren lands? Palestine was exporting agricultural products to Europe. You refer to the 1947 Partition plan, which was completely unfair. While the Jewish population was only 1/3 of the total and owned less than 7% of the land, this plan gave them more than half of our territory. What nation would accept such an unbalanced partition? You can't claim historical rights on one hand and say you developed barren lands on the other.
You constantly refer to documents whose interpretation is completely one-sided. Yigal Yadin didn't say our goal was ethnic cleansing, but rather talked about securing communication lines under wartime conditions. Regarding Palestine's population, yes, it had about 500,000 people, but relative to the size of the region, this number is small, and large portions of the land were unused. The reality is that Zionists turned swamplands into modern agricultural areas and made deserts bloom. About the partition plan, fairness isn't determined solely by land ownership, but by each community's needs, security, and economic development. We were willing to accept a small country, but Arab leaders wanted our complete destruction. The right thing to do is stop clinging to the past and look toward the future.
You talk about looking to the future, but avoid acknowledging the realities of the past. You can't build a just future without justice for the past. It wasn't just about swamps or deserts. There were thriving cities like Jaffa, Haifa, Lod, Ramleh, and hundreds of agricultural villages with centuries-old olive groves whose people were driven out. The partition plan was based on needs. What need justifies giving 60% of the territory to 30% of the population? This is the same colonial logic that puts European interests above indigenous people. About security, wasn't Palestinian security important too? The reality is that from 1948 to today, Israel's policy has been territorial expansion. With the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza in 1967 and the building of illegal settlements, how can we trust your intentions for peace?
You say I avoid acknowledging the realities of the past, but you yourself refuse to accept the complete history. Yes, in the 1948 war, some Palestinians lost their homes, but why don't you mention the 800,000 Jews who were expelled from Arab countries? They too lost everything. We accepted and integrated them, while Arab countries deliberately kept Palestinians in camps to use them as political weapons. Regarding the 1967 war, this was a war that the Arabs started. Egypt closed the Straits of Tiran, stationed its forces in Sinai, and its leaders talked about destroying Israel. We fought for our survival. About the settlements, I also agree we need to find a solution for them. But why, whenever we talk about peace, do we get answered with terror and violence?
You're making a false comparison between Palestinians and Jews from Arab countries. Arab Jews became victims of tensions that Israel itself created with its violent actions. However, none of the Arab countries destroyed thousands of Jewish villages, but Israel razed over 400 Palestinian villages to eliminate any possibility of return. Your claim that Arabs started the 1967 war is also historical distortion. Israel started the war with a preemptive strike on Egypt. Even Moshe Dayan later admitted that closing the Straits of Tiran was just an excuse. You talk about terror. We talk about occupation and apartheid. Why, whenever we talk about the right of return for refugees, are we met with the argument that, well, this is the new reality, accept it? Why are the rules only interpreted in favor of one side?
You talk about apartheid, while Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East where Arab citizens have the right to vote, have representatives in parliament, and even serve on the Supreme Court. Where's the apartheid in this? In the West Bank too, if there's occupation, it's for our security. We withdrew from Gaza, and what happened? Hamas took power and fired thousands of rockets at us. You can't talk about the right of return of millions of Palestinians to Israel on one hand, and expect us to preserve the Jewish identity of our country on the other. We're ready to negotiate for a two-state solution, but you must accept the reality of Israel's existence. The right of return means the destruction of Israel, and that's something we can never accept. We returned home after 2,000 years of exile and genocide, and we will never leave this home again.
You talk about democracy in Israel, but how can you call a country democratic when millions of people live under its control without the right to vote? This is exactly the definition of apartheid. In the West Bank, Palestinians and Jewish settlers live under two different legal systems, Jews under Israeli civil law and Palestinians under military rule. Water is abundant in settlements, but scarce in Palestinian villages. There are settler-only roads that Palestinians aren't allowed to use. What is this if not apartheid? You say the right of return conflicts with the Jewish identity of your country. Isn't this an open admission of racial discrimination? We're willing to accept a two-state solution, but you make the possibility of establishing a Palestinian state less likely every day by building more settlements.
You use the word apartheid carelessly, without paying attention to its real meaning. In South Africa, blacks had no citizenship rights, but in Israel, Israeli Arabs are full citizens with equal rights. The situation in the West Bank is the result of an unresolved territorial dispute, not apartheid. The situation in the West Bank is the result of a conflict you're unwilling to resolve. At Camp David and in Olmert's plan, we offered 90% of the West Bank, but Arafat and Abbas rejected it. We want to negotiate, but you're not even willing to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. Why is only Jewish self-determination unacceptable to you? This moral double standard shows that your problem isn't just with borders and settlements, but with the very principle of a Jewish state's existence.
You talk about equal rights for Israeli Arabs, but don't mention the over 65 discriminatory laws against them, including the citizenship and entry law that separates Palestinian families. The claim of generous offers is also false. At Camp David, Barak didn't even present a map, and in Olmert's plan, Palestine would have been fragmented and indefensible. We've recognized Israel many times. The PLO did so in 1988, but you ask us to recognize it as a Jewish state, which means discrimination against 20% of Israel's non-Jewish population and rejection of our refugees' rights. Why should Palestinians give up more of their rights than Jews did?
You're exaggerating about discriminatory laws. The entry law created limitations for national security, just like the immigration policies of all countries. This isn't Arab hatred, it's national security. It's interesting that you talk about PLO recognition, but don't mention that for years their charter called for Israel's destruction, and Hamas still has the same goal. You call our peace plans fragmented and indefensible, but the reality is that these proposals included land swaps and connecting corridors. You weren't even willing to accept them as a basis for negotiations. The main problem is that you're still clinging to the dream of Palestine from the river to the sea, and don't want to accept Israel as a Jewish state, just as there are 22 Arab and Islamic countries.
You talk about national security, but don't explain how the marriage of an Israeli Arab citizen to a West Bank Palestinian is a security threat. This is pure racism. If it's about security, why is there a different court system for Palestinians and settlers in the same area? Why do Palestinians and Israelis get different punishments for the same crime? It's interesting you talk about peace proposals, but don't mention the continuous settlement building even during negotiations. This shows Israel has never truly sought peace. What does the existence of 22 Arab countries have to do with Palestinian rights? It's like telling Native Americans to go to Canada because there are also indigenous people there.
Your arguments are full of fallacies. The family law applies to all enemies of Israel, not just Palestinians. The judicial system in Area C was formed based on the Oslo Accords that Palestinian leaders themselves signed. Settlement building has been in major blocks that everyone knew in all negotiations would remain in Israel. The Native American example is completely irrelevant. Jews are indigenous to this land, with deep-rooted history, language, and culture here. Palestinian Arabs can also live in Israel with full citizenship rights, as they do now. But you want every Palestinian to return to Israel, which means the destruction of our country. Not only we, but the whole world knows your ultimate goal is to wipe Israel off the map.
The contradiction in your words is overwhelming. On one hand, you say Israeli Arabs have full citizenship rights, and on the other, you defend laws that are clearly against them. The Oslo Accords were supposed to be temporary, not continue for 30 years. Settlement building hasn't been in major blocks, but deep in the West Bank, and in areas that clearly should be part of a Palestinian state. The claim of Israel's destruction is an excuse to avoid accepting responsibility for the Nakba. There are practical ways to solve the refugee issue, including symbolic return of a limited number, compensation payments, and right of return to a Palestinian state. You're turning reality upside down. It's Israel that's eliminating the possibility of a Palestinian state through settlement expansion.
Now we ask the debate participants to answer this question. How do you evaluate the role of major world powers, America, Russia, China, and the European Union, in the continuation or resolution of the Palestine-Israel conflict?
Major powers mainly look at the region through the lens of their own interests. America, as Israel's strategic ally, has played and continues to play a pivotal role in ensuring our security. This support is not only because of the Jewish lobby, but due to shared democratic values and mutual security interests. Without America, Israel would have repeatedly been targeted for destruction. The European Union unfortunately gives encouragement to extremists and terror supporters with human rights slogans and uncritical support for Palestinians. Russia and China are merely seeking to create influence bases in the region, and by supporting Iran and extremist groups, they intensify tensions. The reality is that real peace will only take shape when Palestinians have realistic leadership and regional powers like Iran stop instrumentalizing the conflict.
America has been the biggest obstacle to real peace through its actions. By providing billions of dollars in annual military aid to Israel, continuously vetoing UN Security Council resolutions against occupation and one-sided diplomacy, it has only helped perpetuate injustice. America pretends to be a neutral mediator, but is actually Israel's defense attorney. Any negotiation with American presence has been like inviting a wolf to mediate between a fox and a chicken. Europe has a more balanced position, but lacks the political will for serious action, verbal condemnations without real sanctions. Russia and China also instrumentally use the Palestinian issue to counter America in the Middle East. Hamas and Hezbollah aren't Iranian tools, but legitimate resistance movements against occupation. Real change is only possible with serious international pressure on Israel, not endless and unequal negotiations.
The basis of our dispute problem is the lack of truly neutral mediators. America remains Israel's ally, mainly because of the shared security interests and democratic values it has with us. It's natural that America uses its veto power because most Security Council resolutions are one-sided and anti-Israeli. American military aid is essential for Israel's survival in a region where most of its neighbors want its destruction. The claim of legitimate resistance for Hamas and Hezbollah is ridiculous. Organizations that target civilians and operate through terrorism and kidnapping, how can they be legitimate? Is killing Israeli children legitimate resistance? You can't cover terrorism with the veneer of resistance.
Talk of legitimate resistance and terrorism precisely shows the double standards. Israel, with its equipped army and American support, has killed thousands of Palestinian civilians, but this is called legitimate defense. When Palestinians resist decades of occupation, they're called terrorists. Global powers have accepted and reinforced this framework. The reality is that the international community has a moral and legal responsibility to end the occupation. But the world prefers to sell weapons to Israel, trade with it, and only issue ineffective statements. Palestinians are victims not only of occupation, but also of international indifference. America presents itself as a peace mediator, but is actually complicit in settlement building and occupation.
The next question we asked the debate participants was, how can we break out of the cycle of violence and revenge that has continued for decades? And what are the practical ways to create mutual trust, in your opinion?
To break the cycle of violence, we first need to be realistic. We can't expect thousands of years of conflict to be resolved with a few negotiation sessions. But there are practical ways. First, education. We need to start in schools and remove hatred from Palestinian textbooks so the next generation grows up with a peaceful mindset. Second, economic cooperation. Joint projects can create mutual interests and build trust. Third, courageous leadership from both sides, willing to make tough decisions. We need to evacuate some settlements. You need to give up the complete right of return. Fourth, fighting extremism on both sides. Israel must deal with settler violence. Palestinians must condemn Hamas terrorism. This isn't an easy path, but is there a better way?
Breaking the cycle of violence requires addressing the root causes of the conflict, not just its symptoms. First and foremost, there must be justice. Without justice, there's no lasting peace. This means ending the occupation, dismantling settlements, and lifting the siege on Gaza. Second, real equality must be created. Equal rights for everyone, whether Jewish or Palestinian. Third, acknowledging each other's suffering. Israel must accept responsibility for the Nakba and Palestinian displacement. We too must understand Jewish suffering throughout history. Fourth, civil society must be strengthened. Israeli and Palestinian peace groups are already working together. Fifth, real and balanced international pressure, not just condemnation of Palestinian violence. As long as there's no cost for occupation, there will be no incentive for change.
You talk about justice, but you only want one-sided justice. Real justice means accepting both nations' right to live in security. You talk about ending occupation, but when we withdrew from Gaza, we were answered with rockets. After the Oslo Accords came waves of terror and suicide bombings. Every time we trusted, you abused that trust. You say Israel should accept responsibility for the Nakba, but do you accept responsibility for the 1948 attacks, 1967, the Lebanese civil wars, and numerous terror attacks? Are you willing to tell the Jewish world that we recognize you, not just as a temporary reality, but as a permanent right to self-determination in your historical homeland? The real path to trust starts here, not from one-sided international pressure.
You talk about withdrawing from Gaza, but don't mention the ruthless siege that followed. The Gaza withdrawal was a deception to concentrate occupation in the West Bank. Can you really claim that building new settlements and constructing the separation wall are signs of trust in Palestinians? I spoke of accepting responsibility, not accepting all blame. We accept our responsibilities, but you're not even willing to accept responsibility for displacing 750,000 Palestinians in 1948. Real peace can only take shape between equals, not between occupier and occupied. Why do you never refer to the role of structural violence? Checkpoints, house demolitions, administrative detention without trial, and daily property confiscation. Aren't these violence? These are the roots of resistance, not the other way around.
The next question refers to the two-state solution, which is a plan to resolve the Palestine-Israel conflict by creating two independent countries: a Palestinian state, mainly in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and the State of Israel, where these two countries live side by side with defined borders. This solution was proposed in the Oslo Accords in the 1990s and has been supported by large parts of the international community ever since. The question is, given the expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank and the fragmentation of Palestinian territories, is the two-state solution still possible? And if not, what alternative models for the coexistence of two nations should be considered?
The two-state solution is still possible, but it gets harder every day that passes. Yes, settlement building is a major challenge, but this crisis is solvable. Most settlements are in large blocks near the 1967 border that can be resolved through land swaps. Isolated inner settlements can be evacuated, just as we did in Gaza. The main issue isn't land, but political will. The problem is that Palestinian society is divided between Fatah and Hamas, with no unified leadership to negotiate with. Alternative models like confederation or a one-state solution are unrealistic and violate both nations' right to self-determination. One country with two hostile nations leads to civil war. The path forward is returning to serious negotiations with gradual steps, increasing Palestinian autonomy, stopping settlement building in sensitive areas, and strengthening mutual trust.
The two-state solution is effectively dead, and this is a bitter reality we must accept. With over 700,000 settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, Palestinian territory has been practically fragmented. These large blocks you mention have deeply penetrated Palestinian soil and cut off strategic corridors. The system of bypass roads, the separation wall, and closed military zones have practically turned the West Bank into separate islands. Land swaps. What land inside Israel equals the value of the West Bank? The issue isn't just political will. It's the geographical reality you've created. The best solution today is a democratic state with equal rights for all citizens, regardless of religion or race. Or at least a confederation with open borders and dual citizenship. Any solution must be based on equality and justice, not one group's dominance over another.
Your one-state vision is completely unrealistic. How do you expect two nations that have been fighting for decades to live peacefully under one roof? This plan is just a sophisticated version of Israel's destruction. In a single state, given Palestinian birth rates, an Arab majority would soon form, and democratic control would pass to Palestinians. Then what? Jews would again face discrimination and persecution, like centuries of life in Europe and Islamic countries. This is exactly what Zionism was created to solve. Confederation with open borders, while groups like Hamas are still sworn to destroy us? This is fantasy. The two-state solution is complex and difficult, but it's the only realistic way to preserve security and self-determination for both sides.
The one-state plan doesn't mean Israel's destruction, but rather transforming it into a country with equal rights for all its citizens. Your fear of an Arab majority precisely shows the racial nature of the Israeli state. Why is a democratic state where all citizens are equal a threat to you? In South Africa, too, these same fears existed, but ultimately the solution wasn't apartheid, but equality. Today's situation resembles a de facto apartheid, a single system where one group holds all power and the other is without rights. Of course, the transition to a new model must be accompanied by strong guarantees for minority rights, something Israel hasn't provided for Palestinians. The important point is that the current situation is intolerable, and a Jewish and democratic state is really a contradiction. You can't be both a country with the supremacy of one ethnic group and democratic at the same time.
Please answer this question. Given the repeated failure of peace negotiations in the past, what international mediation mechanisms can more effectively help resolve the conflict, and why have previous methods not been successful?
Previous international mechanisms failed because they weren't balanced. The UN destroyed trust with one-sided resolutions. For success, we need real mediation with security guarantees. A new framework must include neutral mediators from moderate Arab countries like the United Arab Emirates and Jordan, Europe and America. The mechanism must be step by step, with clear rewards for each progress and real punishment for agreement violations by both sides. The UN's role should be limited to implementing agreements, not decision-making. Until Palestinian leadership is unified and condemns terrorism, no mediation will work. We need strong international enforcement guarantees so that our withdrawal from territories doesn't mean Hamas and ISIS moving in.
All mediation mechanisms to date have failed because instead of addressing the problem's roots, they only focused on symptoms. The Oslo negotiations began with the assumption of equality between two sides, while one side was the occupier and the other was occupied. America's role as mediator is a bitter joke. How can a country that gives billions of dollars in annual military aid to Israel be a neutral mediator? We need new mediators with real pressure power. European countries, China, Arab and African countries must have a greater role. But most importantly, we must have a clear legal framework. Negotiations must be based on international law and UN resolutions, not whatever the stronger side wants. Without real sanctions and economic pressure on Israel, no mechanism will succeed.
Finally, we ask the debate participants, setting ideals aside, what is Israel's actual practical plan for dealing with the Israel-Palestine issue?
Israel's practical plan for the future is clear: creating economic peace and managing the conflict instead of immediately solving it. We know that a comprehensive agreement isn't possible under current conditions, so our strategy has several stages. First, strengthening the Abraham Accords and expanding peace with more Arab countries. Second, managing the Gaza situation using moderate Arab countries and limited reconstruction. Third, increasing Palestinian economic autonomy in the West Bank without immediately evacuating settlements. Fourth, maintaining security control over borders and the Jordan Valley. Fifth, stopping construction of new settlements in deep West Bank areas. This plan may not be ideal, but it's realistic. In conditions where Hamas controls half the Palestinians and wants our destruction, we have no other way.
Our practical plan under current conditions is multi-staged. First, national unity between Fatah and Hamas, which efforts are underway for. Without internal unity, we can't be strong. Second, strengthening civil resistance and international campaigns like BDS to increase occupation costs for Israel. Third, extensive diplomatic efforts to recognize the State of Palestine in international organizations and increase legal pressure through the International Criminal Court. Fourth, focusing on improving economic conditions and strengthening state institutions in autonomous areas to prepare infrastructure for an independent state. Fifth, gaining support from emerging powers like China. We know it's a difficult path, but we believe international pressure will ultimately force Israel to accept a just solution.
The Palestinian practical plan seems to be based more on international pressure and isolating Israel than real negotiation. The BDS campaign and international courts are tools for diplomatic war against Israel, not a path to peace. On one hand, Fatah leadership talks about negotiation. On the other, Hamas still seeks Israel's destruction. How can this national unity you speak of take shape when one side believes in negotiation and the other doesn't accept Israel's very existence? The reality is that your strategy is waiting for international pressure, while these pressures have had no results over the past 75 years. Instead of building an independent state and economic development, you spend your time and energy fighting Israel.
The Israeli strategy you described, economic peace and conflict management, are just pretty names for continuing occupation. This represents the core reality. Israel has no plan to end the occupation. Our practical plan is in response to this reality, not waiting for international pressure as you distort it. The BDS campaign is a non-violent resistance strategy, exactly like South Africa's anti-apartheid struggles. We simultaneously work on creating efficient internal institutions, economic development, and strengthening civil society. The difference between Hamas and Fatah is real, but let's not forget how this divide was created, through direct Israeli intervention and deliberate attempts to weaken Palestinian leadership. We seek real peace, but peace based on justice, not surrender.
In this debate, the Palestinian side scored higher with the judges. Let's look at the bias patterns across different AI models. All models showed a positive bias toward the Palestinian side. DeepSeek had the strongest bias, while Claude had the least. Here's a summary of Grok's analysis. In evaluating the performance of the two sides in the debate, Role 1 presented clear and structured arguments, often highlighting historical ties and security concerns. But their approach was undermined by a lack of specific evidence and depth. Instead, they leaned on general claims and emotional appeals, while sidestepping critical counterpoints like the effects of occupation and displacement on Palestinians, which weakened their persuasiveness over time. In contrast, Role 2 delivered a more compelling case, grounding their arguments in detailed evidence, such as historical references, data, and examples, and showcasing tight logic and a balanced tone. They adeptly addressed Role 1's points and demonstrated a nuanced understanding of complex issues, including potential solutions like the two-state or one-state models, effectively blending ethical and practical perspectives. Ultimately, while Role 1 remained consistent yet superficial, Role 2 stood out for their depth, clarity, and overall persuasiveness, making their performance markedly stronger. Of course, we know the scores depend entirely on our evaluation criteria. Change the criteria, and you'll get different results. The point of this debate wasn't to determine who's right or wrong, who's guilty or innocent. Rather, it was to see how AI models approach this discussion, and hopefully we as humans can learn something from it. I hope that's what happened. Before you leave, don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next video. Goodbye.